So hi and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature. We're looking at Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. We're looking at an essay which studies pretty comprehensively the text of the novel, as well as touching upon some of the issues which we discuss in this particular course, looking at the convergence between the literary lens and the traumatic experience. So as you'll be aware by now, this particular essay talks about the color symbolism, the color red in particular, in terms of how that corresponds to certain psychological conditions, certain spiritual conditions, certain embodied corporeal conditions. Now, this should be on your screen, and how red becomes, so the redness becomes almost like a textual semiotic marker across which, through which, generations are connected, disconnected, as well as, articulated. So in the first stage, this is the section called Touching Red. In the first stage, red is a physical and visual presence in the lives of the characters, as opposed to a metaphorical presence, such as in Paul D's Red Heart, which will be addressed in a subsequent section, and the characters involuntarily come to intense bodily contact with it. It is on these occasions that the color moves beyond symbolizing slavery in general and actually literalizes the metaphorical omnipresence of slavery even in the North and years after the Civil War. So there is this metaphorical presence of slavery and a real presence of slavery, right? So the Civil War is a political backdrop in the novel, but then we find that even after years after Civil War, we have these sort of the continual presence of slavery in different forms, real as well as metaphorical. In the three instances, I will analyze in more detail these occurrences of physical contact with the color red are accompanied by forms of voicelessness. Our conversation between Baby Socks and Stamp Paid provides the first elaborate example of the link between physical contact and with slavery's literalized presence and an instance of voicelessness. The discussion takes place in the form when they are both ankle deep in leaves, which are later explicitly described as red. There are two white men burning leaves who turn their heads towards them. The dialogue occurs because of Baby Sock's reaction to school teacher finding her home and invading it without hesitation to come after her family. This experience, more so than any of the sufferings she endured under slavery, about which she often speaks, has left her incapable of calling in the clearing. After this violation, Baby Socks has decided that she will no longer serve as the unchurched preacher of the community. She believed she had lied. There was no grace, imaginary or real. In fact, as Sethe puts it in explaining why she will not talk to Denver about what happened in the woodshed, she and Baby Socks had agreed, without saying so, that it was unspeakable. Not only is the act itself unspeakable, but even the agreement about this state is reached without saying so. Lockhurst has gone so far as to see the necessity of Beloved's haunting grounded in the lack of testimony, as cause are the signals of atrocities, marking sites of untold violence. A haunting does not initiate the story. It is a sign of a blockage of a story. Now, the reason why I've read this out in details is it talks about different forms of violence and different forms of redressals. So we find there's a rejection of the institution of Christianity, the institution of forgiveness, and the institution of articulation. So there's a definite movement away from the church, and a definite acknowledgement and awareness of the falsity of the Christian faith, the falsity or the irrelevance, shall we say, of grace, of goodness, of the stereotypical sentiments which are preached by the church. So there is a rejection of the institution of forgiveness. There is a rejection of the institution of grace. But what is most important over here is the fact that the unspeakability of the event, the unspeakability of the experience, which is what makes it so atrocious in the first place, so violent in the first place. So the violence over here is visceral. The violence is embodied, is corporeal. At the same time, the violence is also a narrative category, in the sense that it is some kind of an experience which cannot be put into a narrative, which cannot be invested into a narrative, right? So therein lies the quality of violence, which is also a narrative category. And if you look at the quotation of Roger Lockhurst at the end from the Trauma Question, where he says that the production of spectrality, the fact that there are so many ghosts. So ghosts can be seen as, again, unspeakable, situations. So situations and conditions which are unspeakable, indescribable, right? So the very idea of the ghost, the very experience or the category of the ghost is something which lies outside of representation, lies outside of ontological boundaries or ontological definitions. So there is a ghostly quality. Now, we can see how the ghostliness in Beloved, or the character of Beloved, or the novel Beloved, the ghostliness is also a narrative category, right? It's something which is outside the narrative. It's something which cannot be spoken about, something which cannot be touched by narrative, by voice, by words, right? So therein lies the quality of the haunting quality in Beloved. Now, this untold violence, this spectrality of violence is something which it doesn't initiate the story, it blocks the story. Now, this is interesting because what Luckhurst is saying over here is how the blockage to a story becomes a narrative device in a certain sense. So we have a device which doesn't just propel the plot as is commonly done. It is also a device through which the plot is interrupted, which is through which the plot is blocked, right? So this blockage of the story is important for us to understand, right? And therein lies a problem, and also the complexity of spectrality and narrativity. Right? This is the convergence we're looking at here, spectrality and narrativity. Now, further emphasizing the multi-layered loss of voice this scene addresses, the discussion revolves around Stamp Paid, trying to, again, another character is trying to convince Baby Socks that you can't quit the word. It's given to you to speak. You can't quit the word. I don't care what all happened to you. Now, again, look at the way in which, the idea of Christianity and narrativity are blended in together. Because, the book of Genesis tells us that, in the beginning there was this word, and the word belonged to God, and the word was God. So that the quality of voice, the quality of language is seen as a divine design. So, and of course, we see Baby Socks over here trying to reject word, trying to reject speech, trying to reject language, trying to move away from language, and trying to acknowledge wordlessness, trying to acknowledge voicelessness, because that seems to be the more authentic state to be, the more authentic condition to be, voicelessness, right? Wordlessness. So this rejection of the word, in a way, is a narrative strategy, in a way that moves away from the normative narrative design, but it's also a spiritual strategy because it's also moving away from the institution of the church, the institution of Christianity. Is the rejection of the word given by God. Because that is seen as irrelevant and insufficient given the atrocities and violence suffered by these subjects. Now, it is in the face of this new reminder of her complete vulnerability to the evils of slavery, when she is standing ankle deep in its physical literalization, when she is covered in the flying fragments of the burnt red leaves, and when the odor of burning leaves was brilliant, the Baby Socks answers Paul D's whispers of the word, where that's the one thing they took away from me, right? So again, the word being taken away from the subject is the voice taken away from the subject. So the subject can only retaliate by a deliberate suspension of language, by a deliberate refusal to speak, by a deliberate and strategic silence, because the word is taken away. And just in the previous session, we were talking about how voicelessness is not really a biological corporeal condition. I mean, it's not saying that you can't make a sound, you can't say anything, but it is also sort of symbolically saying that whatever you say is not meaningful. Whatever you say is not enough, is not relevant, is not substantial, right? And this insubstantiability of certain subjects' voices compared to certain other subjects' voices, that defines and calibrates the politics of articulation. So there are certain kinds of articulation which are more dominant, which are more privileged, and of course certain other forms of articulation which are relegated to the margins, which are marginalized, which are irrelevant, which are powerless and agency-less. So the relationship between agency and voice becomes quite experiential in this novel, particularly with the backdrop of slavery. Right, so Stamp Paid is not able to understand the meaning of a compulsive repetition of "I'm saying they came in my yard" as an explanation of a loss, which is a powerful example of the traumatic event's speakability being hampered by the nature of the experiences and the experiences' outsidedness. Right, so speakability, we find that it becomes a luxury that not anyone can speak. Not everyone has the ability to speak and describe what really took place. So the whole idea of trauma, the whole experience of trauma takes away speakability. So that reputation over here that they came to my yard, right? So that idea is interesting. I'm saying they came in my yard, and yard here is obviously space. So, and also it's also the body in a certain sense. They came in my yard. They came and invaded my yard. They came and invaded my body. They came and invaded my space. So that idea of space as connected to a sense of self is interesting over here, and that is what has been depicted. They came in my yard means they invaded me. They took away my voice. They took away my word, right? So that is told again and again. That is repeated, and this recursive traumatic condition is something which is not really understood by the non-traumatized subject, by the normal, quote-unquote, normal subject, right? So we find how the traumatic repetition over here becomes the most authentic way to talk about the sense of loss, the sense of agency-lessness, right? During the conversation, while he is still energetically scoffing through the red leaves as he went, she is lost any fight, her face knocked clean of interest. She could have been a plate, indifference lodged where sadness should have been. Now, this is a really magnificent line, and also it talks about a very interesting and a very complex cognitive condition where so this repeated consumption of sadness, this repeated consumption of trauma, it generates indifference, right? It takes away sadness because even, I mean, these people are numbed to such an extent, these subjects are numbed to such an extent that they can't even feel sadness anymore, right? So that the repetition of the traumatic encounter, the traumatic event, the traumatic experience, it takes away any gravity of sadness, and all there is left with is indifference, this flatness of indifference. And if you remember, we talked about this cognitive flatness in Malibu when we were discussing Catherine Malibu's The Ontology of the Accident, and also a New Wounded. We're talking about how indifference or non-committal, cognitive non-committal quality becomes a condition of trauma and the traumatized subject. And we also saw a fictional representation of it in Joseph Heller's Catch-22, if you remember, that the soldiers or the veterans or they are numb to such a condition, to such an extent that they can't even feel sad anymore. They can't even feel tragic anymore because this is a tragedy, that they can't feel tragedy anymore, and they're just numbed and indifferent to what is happening around them. So we have a similar situation here. So the face is characterized and marked by indifference, where sadness should have been. He can only desperately try to convince her that a word had been given to her and she had to speak it, had to. He has not reached that stage of resignation in the face of the horrors around him yet. The whole conversation is actually related to the reader as a memory of stamp paid, when the trauma he cannot seem to recover from has invaded his psyche. My marrow is tired, he thought. I've been tired all my days, bone tired, but now it is in the marrow. So again, the depth of trauma has been suggested over here. It has entered the marrow of the system, not just the bones, but the innermost marrow of the human body. So it's almost like an anatomy of trauma, and how the anatomy of trauma becomes an experiential affective category, which takes away all agency. He remembers the conversation and finally understands Baby Sucks's reaction when he himself is holding onto a red ribbon, which appears to be the remains of a black girl who had fallen victim to racial violence, right? So, I mean, this is a deeply disturbing novel, as you can see. So, children are killed, people are just butchered, and, it's racial abuse at a physical, corporeal, epistemic level. But also, I mean, look at the symbols in a story through which violence is depicted in a very disturbing and unsettling manner. So, we find that how Stampede reaches where Baby Sucks is at this point of time, when he just resigns and he reaches a point of resignation when he's holding on to a red ribbon of a dead girl, of a dead black girl, the remains of a black girl, and who's just been abused, physically, perhaps sexually as well. And this is the long drawn-out racial violence which has happened over centuries. Paul D's time in captivity in Ofra, Georgia, a place that signifies the mental and physical brutality of slavery by causing a condition of living death designed to erase manhood and humanity, is a further instance of physical contact with red combined with shock and voicelessness. So we can see how, for someone like Paul D, emasculation as a very physical experience, as a very symbolic experience, is also connected to voicelessness. The fact that he's emasculated, is erased, is deprived of all his manhood, sexually, physically, and also he's dehumanized at a very direct level, right? And that systemic process of dehumanization and emasculation is part of the agencylessness and voicelessness that he is suffering. Certainly, his experience at a prison camp is one of immense psychological trauma. Prisoners are raped and beaten routinely. The entire purpose of the prison camp is for the slaves to use their hammers to kill the flirt whom folks call life from leading them on, making them think that the next sunrise would be worth it, that another stroke of time would do it at last. Only when she was dead would they be safe, right? So, deadness is only escape. Being dead is only escape because, it's a repeated ritual of abuse and trauma and torture. And this is a camp where torture is not just legitimized, it's an industry of torture. This is how identities are broken, how identities are fragmented, how identities are taken away. And you find that this degree of dehumanization, which becomes almost an industry in camps like this, and this is a process through which certain kinds of subjects are broken and rendered fragile and precarious and vulnerable, whereas certain other forms of subjectivity becomes dominant. Obviously, the relationship, the division of areas, racial and quality. The voicelessness of this place, the sheer lack of verbal sounds coming from black people, is subject to a detailed description in the novel. So it's a silent suffering, and the silence of suffering is what makes it even more brutal in a certain sense. There is no voice of pain, there's no voice of hurt, there's no cry, there's no shriek. It's just silent suffering throughout this process of torture. Once more, this particular instance of voicelessness is not solely due to an inability to process the traumatic event, but is also enforced by slavery's representatives. In accordance with the novel's narrative project of portraying the cruelties of slavery, the inflictors of trauma actually order what would otherwise be its psychological consequences. Prisoners are not allowed to talk to one another, so they have to find different ways of communicating. Right, so we can see how torture moves from the corporeal condition to a psychological condition, to an emotional condition. So they are completely alienated. They're not allowed to talk to anyone. There's no human contact except for the perpetrators of violence. So there's no word spoken. There's no one to speak to. There's no one to speak with. Right. So that again, that voicelessness is something which is systematically produced out of the processes and rituals of torture. The eyes had to tell what there was to tell. Even in expressing their emotions in song, there is a need for garbling the words so that they could not be understood, tricking the words so the syllables yielded up other meanings, right? So we find also what's happening here is the production of codes. So the black subjects over here who rendered as slaves, they need to produce some coded forms of communication. They need to produce an alternate order of meaning through songs, through different kinds of rhymes. In fact, the prisoners invest what little sound is allowed with an almost mythical quality. Shouting, the signal to get off one's knees, was the first sound other than yes sir. A black man was allowed to speak each morning. They called him High Man, probably believed to this day that the high at dawn and the who, when evening came, were the responsibility of High Man, assumed because he alone knew what was enough, what was too much, when things were over, when the time had come. So you find this High Man over here, this H-I, high, is also H-I-G-H. So there's a superior man, and superiority or supremacy is conferred to the white people, the whiteness, and the black person is just allowed to say yes sir. And the only other sound that was allowed to the black man is getting off one's knees, right? So again, getting off one's knees, standing up, suggests that a fallen state. So the fallenness of the black man is symbolized over here. The physical fallenness, the emotional fallenness, the existential fallenness, which is systematically perpetrated by these rituals of torture. So it is surely no coincidence that the text sets this most overtly brutal manifestation of the institution of slavery in Georgia, a place not only deep in the south, but also famous for the color of its soil. One of the first things which the text points out in narrating Paul D's arrival at a prison camp is that the boxes which serve as a prisoner's cells during the night are set 5 feet deep in the red dirt of Georgia. The plethora of abuse which is inflicted upon Paul D happens, as the novel explicitly states at the beginning of the passage, on red earth, right? So again, the color red becomes interesting. It literally becomes a landscape, a soil, the earth in which the slavery or the institutional slavery, institutional torture is practiced and executed, almost on an industrial level. Moreover, Paul D is actually buried in his trope of slavery every night in his cell, his only resting place, which is highly reminiscent of a coffin. He has 2 feet of it over his head at all times, right? So, I mean, I stop at this point in this session, but what is interesting for us to understand how there is a sepulchral quality about redness. So it's almost like everyone is already in a coffin, everyone is already dead. And this is obviously a part of the dehumanization, because as human beings, they are already dead. So it's just symbolically appropriate, perversely speaking, that they are already in a coffin, they're already buried. So there's this red soil in which they are sinking in, their feet are sinking in, it's sort of buried deep, and their little cells in which they're imprisoned reminds them of a coffin. It looks like a coffin as well. So there is a sepulchral quality in which they are buried, imprisoned, tortured, and confined. So we can see, as in nervous conditions, space here also becomes quite symbolic. The space of torture, the space of imprisonment, the space of identity production, manipulation, torture, abuse. So all these become very, very carefully calibrated and carefully constructed in order to enact trauma at a daily level, in order to enact or subject the traumatized person, into different kinds of trauma: corporeal, bodily, existential, emotional. So we have examples of physical beating, physical corporeal violence, but also examples of alienation. They are separated from each other, they're not allowed to talk to anyone. And so they literally become voiceless, they have no one to talk to. And instead, all they see around them is a red soil, red earth, red buildings. And the psychological condition of redness, this constant redness around them, is what makes them traumatized subject, is what informs the traumatized states of being. Right, so we'll stop at this point today, and we'll begin to wind up this essay and the novel in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.